It all started when Mark received an old, yellowed letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words written in a shaky script. He stared at the envelope for a moment before carefully opening it. Inside was a single page with a strange warning. Do not go to the monastery. The nun is waiting. His heart skipped a beat as he read it again. Mark had always been curious about abandoned places, and the monastery on the hill was one of the most mysterious locations in town. No one had stepped foot there in years, and it was said to be cursed. Locals spoke in whispers about strange noises and ghostly figures seen in the windows. Yet, Mark couldn't resist. He had to see it for himself. The letter was unsettling, but it only fueled his desire to explore the monastery. That night, he gathered his camera and flashlight, eager to uncover the secrets hidden in the abandoned building. Mark was determined to capture the truth. He wasn't scared of ghost stories. But little did he know, this journey would change everything. As he walked toward the monastery, the wind picked up. The trees seemed to sway in a rhythm that felt unnatural. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off. He was only going to explore, to find out what was really going on in that monastery. When he reached the gate, it creaked open on its own, as though inviting him inside. Inside the monastery, the air was thick with dust and silence. The walls, covered in faded murals, seemed to stare at him with haunting eyes. He felt as if the building was alive, watching him with an eerie presence. But it wasn't the place that frightened him. It was a feeling, the sense that something or someone was watching him. As Mark walked deeper into the monastery, he heard the faint sound of footsteps. His heart pounded. He turned quickly but saw nothing. The steps grew louder, coming closer. He shone his flashlight in all directions, but there was no one. His breath quickened and a sense of dread filled the air. Something was wrong, but what? Suddenly, a door slammed shut somewhere behind him. Mark froze, his eyes wide with fear. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the whole building had just held its breath, waiting. His curiosity, now mixed with fear, made him move forward, but with every step his unease grew. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel it. Something dark was lurking within the walls of this place. Mark continued walking, though his confidence had started to fade. He had always prided himself on being brave, but now, every creak of the floorboards made him jump. He reached a large, broken window and looked out. The view of the town below seemed far away, as if the monastery stood in another world entirely. The world he knew felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. That's when he saw it. A figure, dressed in black, standing motionless in the hallway. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure was a woman, but there was something off about her. Her face was obscured by a veil, but he could sense a powerful presence coming from her. It was the nun from the stories. Mark had heard about her from the locals, but he never believed it until now. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at him from the shadows. Mark's mind raced. Was it a ghost? Was it someone playing a trick on him? He didn't know, but his instincts told him to run. Yet, something held him there, frozen in place, as if the figure had some sort of power over him. Without warning, the woman began to move toward him. Her footsteps were slow but deliberate, echoing in the empty hall. Mark tried to move, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as though he was trapped in some invisible grip. His heart pounded in his chest. The closer she got, the colder the air became. He could feel the temperature dropping, his breath turning to mist in front of him. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the woman stopped. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Her eyes were hidden behind the veil, but Mark could feel her gaze piercing through him. The silence was suffocating. Then, in a voice that sent chills down his spine, she spoke. "Leave, or suffer the consequences." Mark's body went cold with fear. He didn't move. He couldn't. The nun's presence was overwhelming, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to get out of there. But before he could react, The woman turned and disappeared into the darkness. The silence returned, but now it felt heavier, thicker, as though something was waiting in the shadows. Mark didn't leave. He couldn't. Something about the nun's warning felt unfinished. It was as if she wanted him to uncover something that had been hidden for years. He felt compelled to follow her, to find out the truth behind the ghostly figure and the monastery's dark past. As Mark explored deeper into the building, he came across a dusty old book lying on the ground. It was bound in leather, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. He carefully opened it, hoping it would hold some answers. The book was filled with old prayers, drawings, and strange symbols, but one section caught his eye. It was about the nun who had once lived here. The story told of a young nun who had taken a vow of silence, living her life in the monastery as a servant of God. But as the years passed, she became obsessed with the idea of purifying the souls of others, even if it meant using extreme measures. Some said she had used dark rituals. Others claimed she had become possessed by a demon. Whatever had happened, she was no longer the woman she once was. The book described how the nun's obsession grew. She began to isolate herself from the others, spending her days in the monastery's hidden chambers, performing rituals that no one understood. Her actions became more violent, and the once peaceful monastery became a place of fear. The other nuns feared for their lives and eventually fled, leaving the evil nun behind. The last entry in the book was chilling. The nun is waiting. She will never leave. Mark's hand trembled as he closed the book. He realized that the figure he had seen earlier was not a mere ghost. It was her, the evil nun, still haunting the abandoned monastery, waiting for anyone who dared to enter. As Mark stood there, his mind racing with the dark history he had just uncovered, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A whisper. It was soft at first, like a faint breeze, but it grew louder, coming from all directions. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around him. The whispers sounded like dozens of voices, all speaking at once, but none of the words were clear. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to understand what was happening. The voices grew louder, more urgent, as though they were trying to tell him something. He could feel a pressure building in his head, as if the very walls were closing in on him. The whispering became frantic, and Mark could hear his name being called out in the chorus. Mark, Mark, Mark! He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed by fear, trapped in the center of the room, surrounded by the voices. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The whispers grew louder, more intense. They were coming from everywhere. Then, one voice stood out above the rest. It was a low, raspy voice that made his skin crawl. You shouldn't have come. The word sent a chill through Mark's body, and suddenly, the room felt even colder. He opened his eyes to find himself alone, but the whispering continued. He turned, looking around, but there was no one there. It was as if the voices were coming from the very walls themselves. He could feel the presence of something unseen, something evil, watching him. He knew it was her, the nun. Mark knew he had to leave, but the monastery seemed to have changed. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, pulsing with dark energy. Every step he took, he felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting, changing. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. Mark stumbled down the dark hallway, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The whispers had stopped, but the air was thick with dread. He could feel the evil presence all around him, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The temperature had dropped to freezing, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He had to get out. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway slammed open. Mark froze. There, standing in the doorway, was the nun. This time, she wasn't just a figure in the shadows. She was real, and she was right in front of him. Her eyes, hidden behind the veil, glowed with an unnatural light. Her face was pale, lifeless, with a look of pure malice. Mark could feel the evil radiating off her, and he knew this was the moment he had feared. "You shouldn't have come," she repeated, her voice low and menacing. Mark tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, and his voice wouldn't come. The nun took a step forward, and the ground beneath Mark's feet seemed to tremble. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and thin like the branches of a dead tree. Mark wanted to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, trapped in her gaze. "Leave, or you will become part of me," the nun whispered. With those words, Mark felt a coldness envelop his body. His vision began to blur, and he could hear his heart beating in his ears. Everything around him started to spin, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the nun's face, smiling. Mark woke up in the monastery, but everything was different. The walls were intact, the air no longer cold, and the whispers were gone. It felt like time had stopped, but he knew better. He had narrowly escaped the nun's grasp. The question was, what had she wanted with him? Why had she spared him? As he stumbled out of the monastery, he realized he had no answers, only questions. The nun was still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too close. Mark knew that the story of the evil nun was far from over, and as he left the monastery, he heard one last whisper, "You will return,